All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the WorkSmart Recovery, Innovation, and Access Workshop 2 of our series. Today's workshop is going to be a focus on community engagement and communications. Our workshop will be a presentation from Dr. Brea Heidelberg, Associate Professor and Director of the Entertainment and Arts Management Program at Drexel University and founder of ISO Arts Consulting. My name is Danielle Stobie, Arts Education Manager with ArtsFairfax. I use she, her pronouns and have indicated this on Zoom. At this time, please rename yourself with your name, organization, and pronouns. Please also double check that your microphone is muted, and if you have any questions, please include them in the chat. This session will be recorded, and we will have all recordings available as soon as possible on our website. We also have live closed captioning available that you can turn on by clicking the up arrow next to closed captioning and selecting Show Subtitle. I would now like to hand it over to our President and CEO, Linda Sullivan.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Linda Sullivan, President and CEO of ArtsFairfax. I use pronouns she, her. I'm white. I'm with brown hair, and I'm not going to describe what I'm wearing because I'm having communications problems, so I'm only going to be on by phone. So I do want to say I hope everyone is doing well and looking forward to emerging from this pandemic as strong as can be. The arts are so important to our recovery. What you do is so important to our recovery, and I hope everybody is doing well. We are trying to get as much helpful information and resources to you that we can. And so this workshop series is part of our effort to provide information as well as grants. I thank Brea so much for being with us. We're looking forward to, tapping into her wisdom and recommendations. So thank you so much and enjoy the workshop series.
Thank you, Linda. I'm just going to pop up my screen again really quick. So this is just a short overview and goals we have for our WorkSmart workshops. The goal is to build capacity of arts organizations and artists to engage people in arts and culture by increasing knowledge and understanding of diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. And we have some different bullet points here for how we will do this. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and give just a short overview of the day. So we are going to have, as I said, Brea presenting for the first hour, and then we will have an additional 30 minutes after that hour for questions and discussions. Please feel free to type questions into the chat throughout the presentation. And now I'd like to go ahead and formally introduce Brea. So she is an arts management educator, consultant, and researcher focusing on the intersection of the arts and other fields of study. She serves as an associate professor and director of the Entertainment and Arts Management Program at Drexel University. She also founded ISO Arts Consulting, which focuses on human resources issues in the nonprofit arts, particularly issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some of you may remember Brea from the Community Roundtable, and we are so thrilled that she's back to facilitate today and our next session in the series. So Brea, whenever you want to take it away.
Great. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to hop right in. There will be some space for breakout groups and breaks. Please adult as necessary if you need to pop off to grab a snack or use the restroom or get some water. Just, put stop video and do what you need to do. So let me share my screen and then we'll get started. Okay, so I'm a fairly decent Zoom DJ. So if you feel the need to interrupt me, if you have a question, just go ahead and pop it in the chat. I do have that window up, so I should be able to see it. Additionally, if you're comfortable sharing your question or comment with everyone, please feel free to do so. If you want to send it directly to me, just make sure that you're sending me a private message. I will read out the question so that everybody knows what I'm responding to, but I will not attribute it to a particular individual. Okay. So today we're going to talk about community engagement and communications, and we're going to take a focus internally within the organization for that. So I'm going to go over some ground rules for today as far as conversations go, but we're going to talk about organizational culture and how it directly connects to equity work. Then we're going to talk about how that work connects to engaging employees, volunteers, and community members, and thinking about ways to be welcoming on your way to becoming more equitable and inclusive. There's going to be ample time for question and discussion. And as was stated before, I will be facilitating the next session as well. So this information is going to directly connect to and be a bit of a foundation for us to build upon for next time too. So you've got some stuff to look forward to. So for our discussion today, I want to make sure everyone is aware that we are creating more so than a safe space, actually, I would change that to be a brave space. So a brave space is one in which we are willing to share and be vulnerable and allow space and grace for other people to share and be vulnerable as well. You might not agree with everything that's being said, but we're hoping that everybody can come to the conversation as their authentic selves and with the understanding of some of the other points that I'm going to make down here. The other thing that I want to make sure is that everybody is speaking from their own experience, and you want to focus on using I statements. So focus on your experience, the impact that you are having as an individual, and the ways in which you operate both in your organization and in your communities. As a result of creating a brave space, people may share stories and contexts that help illuminate some of their lived experiences and some of the points that I'm going to make. The particulars about the story should stay. The lessons that you take away from those stories can definitely leave this group. So this is going to be our virtual Vegas for now. What happens here as far as the stories and the particulars and the names and the organizations should stay, but the lessons can leave. Accept that there are many lived experiences and truths. So the way in which you operate in the world is a unique function of your various areas of privilege and marginalization. And so is the next person's. So something might be absolutely true to you that is not absolutely true to the next person. Be mindful of the people that you may not always see. So a great analogy for this are the blind spots that exist in our cars. When we're driving, we have mirrors that help us see the other people around us to make sure that we're safe, and that both in our cars, and we're safe as we're changing and moving things. However, there are spots where those mirrors simply do not reach. And so in order to safely make change or change lanes, you do need to get into the practice of physically turning and checking your blind spots. The same goes for this type of work. In equity work, there might be somebody driving right alongside you that you never see or truly see or fully see just because of your lived experience. So we want to get into the habit of checking those spots that we don't often think about, or that might not be an active part of our everyday lived experience based on the ways in which our particular car mirrors reflect, right? Remember that you are an unfinished masterpiece. So who you were yesterday is not necessarily who you are today and who you might be tomorrow. So if as a result of this conversation, some of the stories bring up things that you might not have gotten 100% right in the past, we are all here to learn. And just because you've made a mistake or a misstep in the past does not necessarily mean that you must continue to make that same mistake or misstep in the present or in the future. So let's just give ourselves a little bit of grace, shall we? Just a more full introduction of who I am and how I came to be in this space. So my name is Brea. Feel free to call me Brea. Only my students call me Professor Heidelberg. And only people that make me really angry have to call me Dr. Heidelberg. So that's pretty much the hierarchy of nomenclature. My background is as a dancer and choreographer, so I do enjoy being in physical spaces with people and watching nonverbal communication cues as well. I'll do what I can in this space. And yeah, that's the other bits about me that aren't the full-on professional side of things. I also have a 4-year-old, which means that I'm tired all the time, and I do bring my mother self and my caregiver self to my work as well. So we are going to do a couple of breakout sessions today. The first one is going to be to address what you hope to get out of the day today. So I'm going to randomly assign you to your rooms. Hold on, let me make sure that I have enough people per room. Okay, so for this first breakout session, there's going to be one person that's going to be a moderator. And the person that's going to be the moderator this time around is the person with the most pets. So amongst yourselves, figure out who has the most pets. That person is going to be your moderator. The moderator's job is to make sure that everybody who wants to speak has an opportunity to speak and to be mindful of the time. So I'm going to give you about 4 minutes right now to just think about what you want to get out of today. This is a great time to just take a breath. If you were rushing from another meeting, to focus on just sitting and being fully in this session and thinking about what you hope comes out of this hour and a half that we'll spend together. Okay. So you should see an indicator that allows you to join your breakout room. Yeah. Okay. So who would like to share some of what their group discussed in your breakouts?
Hi, this is Tracy. I can go with our group.
Sure.
We have 2 theater groups and a nonprofit for historic preservation group and an artist. And all 2 of us are looking for ways to be more inclusive. We have limited demographics in our organizations and with our volunteers and the attendees who come to our programs, and looking for the right words to use, like the ways to communicate, as well as how to just engage and with a more diverse audience.
Thank you.
I'm Deb from MPA, and I was in group 7. We had a great group, including one person from Rockville, so getting a Maryland perspective on this issue, and somebody from Next Up Theater in Herndon, somebody from the Hilton Arts Center in Prince William County, and then 2 of us coincidentally from MPA in McLean. And so I think the thing we all had in common was the goal of learning more about what we can do to make our programming more accessible in a meaningful way with the communities that we serve in the Herndon and Prince William County experiences. They are in very diverse communities, but they're looking for more ways to engage those communities with their programming. And in McLean, we're not as diverse, but we definitely would like to make our programming more accessible to the diversity that is prevalent in so much of Fairfax County. And so I think it's a great point to start with, that we're just all looking for ways to do a better job of engaging more people, because this is a very diverse part of our country.
Thank you. One more group, representative for one more group like to share?
And sure. I am Susan with the Reston Chorale. We had 4 people in our group, and we were looking to fill in the gaps of our knowledge about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We wanted to learn about how to safely and kindly engage in these conversations, and learn more about the next steps. How do we evolve in our knowledge and in our engagement?
Thank you.
That's
great. All right, so I'm gonna share my screen again. We're gonna pop back in. And thank you to those who were willing to share. So just some foundational stuff. Systems replicate and protect themselves. So even if you were to Go to all of the training sessions and educate yourself as an individual and each other as staff members in engaging in interpersonal everyday like work life. The systems that are in place within your organization, if there are inequities in them that are not being actively rooted out and changed, the system will replicate and protect itself. I know it sounds a little like sci-fi and matrixy, but that's when inequities in systems do. That's why it's called systemic inequality and systemic racism, because even if somebody is not actively trying to create harm, if you are not actively trying to eradicate and rectify harm, harm will still be done. Hearts and minds are great. When I first started doing this work, I thought to myself, oh, I'm just going to change everybody's hearts and minds that don't believe in this work. And over time, I've come to understand that hearts and minds are awesome sauce if you can get them. However, behaviors and reinforcement are better. Even if somebody doesn't wholeheartedly 100% believe in all of the systemic inequities that exist in our country, I still need you to act right at work. I still need you to act right whenever you're engaging with community members, right? So it's really important to focus on the displayed behaviors and the ways in which they create positive impact or create harm, more so than it is to focus on the hearts and minds, which often are a part of the package, but don't necessarily have to be. And some people get stuck focusing on that instead of the behaviors. Finally, equity work is hard, but meaningful and worthwhile. And so without clear boundaries and accountability mechanisms, people will revert to old behaviors. Equity work is like working out. The first couple of times suck and are extremely humbling. Over time, you get better. You build up your muscles and your capacity and your muscle memory to be able to engage in equity work. And so the work does get easier over time, but you have to stick at it. So if you were a runner before and you stopped for an extended period of time, you are going to have to build up that stamina again. If you're a rower or a gymnast and you stop for a while, you do have to rebuild those calluses on your hands and on your feet. Equity work is very similar. So one thing that's important to remember about the ways in which you can engage with organizations or different community members is that it's not just about the words that you say, it's the actions that you enact every day. And so there have been multiple iterations of quote unquote equity work in the field, nonprofits in general, in faith-based organizations and communities, as well as in the arts. We have experienced multiculturalism. We have experienced, that was the 80s. We have experienced, revitalization and reinvestment in communities that focused on youth in the 90s and early aughts. We have also seen creative placemaking. So some of this language and initiatives and imperatives to become more equitable are not new, but harm that has been associated with failed attempts is also not new. So there are people within your communities that hear your renewed commitments or your new commitments to equity and inclusivity work, but this might be the underlying sentiment that you need to address. One of the best ways to address this is by thinking about your organizational culture. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. I came here to talk about how to communicate with people and how to be more inclusive. I guarantee you that organizational culture is one of the best access points for this. So that is the values and associated manifestations of those values that create an organization's social and psychological environment. So what does that mean in practice? Because I definitely gave you the nerd version. What that means is that organizational culture will eat up everything else that you throw at it. So anytime that you've had a change initiative or a growth initiative, or you wanted to innovate in some way, and you've ended up reverting back to how your organization, quote unquote, always is, it's because you have an organizational culture issue. I've done a lot of recruitment and selection work as organizations have tried to diversify their workforce. I've seen, some staff that are pushed out at the entry and mid levels, but I've also seen executive director leadership that's been pushed out because the organizational culture is stronger than your organizational hierarchy. So your entry-level and mid-level staff, your volunteers could presumably run your organization from an organizational culture perspective. And sometimes that sneaks up on people. So this is a chart that provides some of the socially acceptable, increasingly socially acceptable in many cases, ways that white supremacy operates within a lot of organizations. Now, many organizations are actively working against some of these things, such as, English only initiatives, like being mindful of the languages that are spoken in your communities and how there might need to be translated materials or multiple languages just operating on an everyday basis within your organization. But nonprofits, social sector, many social services organizations have longstanding issues with white savior complex, a Eurocentric focus, self-segregation of your communities. All of these things are ways that are signals, as far as your organizational culture is concerned, to people about who does belong in and around your organization and who does not. So I'm talking a lot about organizational culture. How do you know what your organizational culture is? Some things to be mindful of is that what is stated does not always align with the lived experience, right? So there was a lot of like blog posts and news articles about the fact that over the past summer, a lot of organizations were coming out with, equity-based statements and support of BIPOC individuals. That's what's stated, and then you go to their staff and their board of directors page and it's not the lived experience, right? Sometimes what you mean to have happen as part of your organizational culture is not what happens every day within your organization. Organizational culture can both be explicit and implicit. So that is the difference between what is stated in maybe your code of conduct or your onboarding materials, and then what actually happens in practice. You might have a very long and involved stated practice for the ways in which you engage with new members in your organization, or people for whom this is their first educational program or their first artistic event that they're coming to. But the way that it works out implicitly, whenever you're overbooked and the grant cycle is really heavy and you're having a lot of programming, you might shortchange that long process. So it's both explicit and implicit. Organizational culture does not impact everyone in the organization in the exact same way. So I often, when I'm working with boards and we talk about organizational culture and I do equity audits, I remind people all the time that your bylaws are probably racist, because people assume that if something is official, that it's neutral. And that is not the case. If there is a human involved in the creation of the thing, then there is bias involved in the creation of the thing. And so thinking about the ways to actively identify and root out those elements of inequity that may exist are really important. So I got a question in the chat. How do you distinguish diversity and equity from affirmative action with which many view negatively? So diversity and equity, and I'm going to assume that's from a hiring perspective, since affirmative action tends to also be from a hiring perspective. So when it comes to being diverse and equitable in your recruitment and selection processes, gosh, that's a whole nother workshop. I'll give you the Cliff Notes version so you can pass your reading quiz at the beginning of class. And that is, you're thinking about the entirety of the individual. You're making sure that you're putting in the salary information and that your required qualifications aren't just markers of a particular type of class and culture, and that your position description and what you're requiring of the individual is actually knowledge-based and skill sets that directly align with the work that you want them to do. Many believe that affirmative action is not a good thing, and that's based on a negative political sort of smear campaign about affirmative action. So in my PhD life, I looked at advocacy rhetoric. So words are my jam, and the way in which we use words as weapons is really interesting to me. So the ways in which sometimes people seeing affirmative action is negative is that there is a presumption that somebody less qualified will get a role or a position simply because they identify as part of a currently or historically marginalized population. In practice, when you look at the research on affirmative action, it actually doesn't work out that way. The people that tend to benefit from affirmative action are Asian Americans and white women. So the swath of switch over from executive directorship that we tend to see that we're seeing in the field over the past 5 to 7 years, where we're seeing a lot of white male executive directors replaced with white women executive directors and people heralding that as an equity job well done, that's affirmative action more so than somebody that doesn't even know how to read becoming executive director just because they're from a marginalized population. However, when asked, on average, a lot of people think that the problems with affirmative action are the latter and not necessarily incomplete allyship or a lack of consideration for intersectionality. And we can totally jam out about that in the discussion part later. There's another question. I'm going to read the question, and I think I'm going to hold off on addressing it, but I am going to read it out loud now so that it doesn't get lost in the chat, and you all can keep me honest about whether or not I've actually addressed this at the end. So the question is, in these highly polarized times, how have organizations handled board members and staff members with extreme political views in their personal life that have sometimes leaked into their work within the organization? Oh, actually, I can go ahead and address that one right now. Doop, doop, doop. Hearts and minds are great, but behaviors and reinforcement are better. So that means that a person can believe what they want in their home life, but that they need to adhere to the behaviors and the standards of care that are explicitly stated within the organization. Now, that means that the organization has some work to do in determining what those standards of care and behaviors are, and then holding people accountable to them. What this means in practice is that not everybody's going to come with you. Not everybody's going to make it with you in your organization to the promised land of equity. In order to be more inclusive to the individuals that have been traditionally not a part of your organizations, you might have to let go some of the people that are holding you back from achieving that goal. And that can be a difficult and painful process, but a necessary process, because you really can't welcome everyone into your organization if the everyone that you're welcoming into your organization also does not welcome everyone, if that makes sense. Okay, so those were the two questions that I saw. The overarching thing about organizational culture is that community members, both those that are actively a part of your organization and those that are just aware of or tangentially aware of your organization, they know your organizational culture when they see it. Some indicators, so things that you can start to be on the lookout for. Explicit manifestations look like interpersonal interactions. How do people engage with one another, both that are coworkers, board to staff or board to executive director? How do internal staff interact with volunteers? And how does everybody interact with the constituents that you serve? Looking at your codified rules, looking at your decision-making processes. Who's involved in your decision-making processes, who's excluded from your decision-making processes, and how are those communicated? Some implicit things that are a part of your organizational culture: emotions. Things that we get sad or mad about are things that are important to us. So if there are heightened emotions around certain topics, ideas, programs, it's important to take stock of that. Physical artifacts. So for example, in an organization where people are actively encouraged and not penalized for being a full human being and bringing themselves to work, you tend to see more tchotchkes on the desk, like pictures of family members or pictures of things that people enjoy, little artifacts from vacation, because you are allowed to be a full person. In organizations where the organizational culture is work or bust and it's high achievement and you should be working 70-hour work weeks, you tend to not see any of that on the desk because workers do not feel comfortable reminding other people about the fact that they are a full human being. So physical artifacts can be an indication of organizational culture. Things that are missing from conversations, spaces, and consideration. So for example, if you have a a meeting room that you want people to engage with and use, but there's only 3 chairs, that's an indication of what's important to your organization. And it might be that people know that those 3 chairs belong to the people with the most amount of organizational authority and power, right? So there are subtle ways that organizational culture also knows. So there was a question that I said, if an organization has bylaws, they are racist. And the question was, how can you say that without seeing parts of those bylaws and even inferentially white superior or POC negative? So there's been a lot of research done on the ways in which nonprofit organizations were founded and how most of them came out of white supremacist underlying presumptions about how to serve, and by serve, that means how to like save other communities. And so most of our bylaws are created within the United States. And I say are because it's not necessarily just white-led organizations. POC-led organizations also subscribe to a lot of these rules and tenets and common things. So a lot of bylaws presume a certain socioeconomic status. So it might not just be racist, but it could be inequitable. They presume a socioeconomic status. They presume a certain level of education in many instances. A lot of bylaws do not account for more open decision-making processes or organizational structures that adhere to a lot of feminist and particularly Black feminist ways of making decisions. So that's why I can say that by and large, most organizations, if they have not actively looked at their bylaws to eradicate those elements, they're most likely baked in. So one thing about actively noticing your organizational culture, look at the way respect and fairness is discussed and displayed throughout the organization, the ways trust and integrity are discussed and displayed throughout the organization, and whether or not your organization results orientation, whether you're only focused on, was that a program highly attended, was it well funded, rather than the humanity of the process of getting to the outcomes. So that's those are some big things where you can find a lot of information about how your organization operates. From an interpersonal perspective, how do employees talk with each other? How happy are they on average? Do people have a largely like similar understanding of the meaning and purpose of the organization and the work that they do? Are there learning opportunities? How does teamwork work? How does accountability work if somebody doesn't hold up their end of the bargain? And finally, process. How do we communicate amongst ourselves? How do we communicate to external partners? How do we communicate to people that we hope to invite into the organization? What are the decision-making capacities? Are those individuals that are going to be impacted by the decisions included in the making of said decisions? How does your organization handle change? And what's your organization's overall strategy? So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, like 4 minutes, to think about some of the ways your organizational culture might be unwelcoming to the people that you are actively seeking to engage with. So I'm going to send you back into your breakout groups. This time around, your moderator is going to be the individual that has been with their particular organization for the longest. So that person's job, again, is just to make sure that everybody who wants to speak has a chance to speak and to be mindful of the time reminders that I'm going to throw into your rooms. Okay?
Anybody there?
Yes.
Can you guys hear me? Nope.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Well, I guess we got kicked out of our breakout session a little early somehow.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Did you click on anything?
No problem.
Because it shouldn't do that.
I might have. I didn't think so.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay.
User error then. No problem.
Either one or both of us. Welcome back, magical people. So, who would like to share some of what their group discussed?
Well, since this is Kevin Harnish, and since I came back a little early, in my apologies to my group. I must have hit the wrong button. So on breakout 3. So we discussed the makeup of the board, challenges we have of getting a more diverse board, and we also discussed the challenges we have that even though a lot of our programming is focused on diversity, that our patrons are not as diverse as we would like.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to share?
I'll share for our group. One of the things that we talked about was how sometimes organizations have kind of a hard-baked bias within the organization, and taking a good look at ourselves internally, and also how we present our organizations, say on our website, so that people, if our membership is not very diverse, or how do we reflect where we want to be. And then, let's see. Oh, and some of the organizations, in the arts, whether it be museums or opera or, other forms of art, can be intimidating to people. And we want to be able to find ways to reach out and engage people.
Thank you. I will share that one of the easiest ways to sort of reconcile an accurate reflection of who your organization currently is and where you would like to be is just to explicitly state that. A lot of people underestimate how purposeful and powerful it can be if you do have most of your board and your board presents a particular way and you say, we are actively working to do this. An explicit statement about how about the change that you want to see is a lot more meaningful. I know when I'm looking at websites of organizations that I might want to engage with or an organization that I might want to try out, there's a difference between just putting it up there and letting it stand and putting it up there and also saying, we see this. Because if there's no message there, I'm not sure if that that's not like how I would want to engage with your organization, right? So some of it is explicit messaging that you can see and acknowledge that there's a difference or there might be some gaps between where you are now and where you would like to be. The other thing that I will say as far as being welcoming in spaces and with art forms that might seem intimidating is to diversify your creators that you showcase or that you highlight, and be mindful about where you put those pieces of work and when. So one of my favorite parts about the Philadelphia Museum, not the ways that they staff or retain particular staff of color, but when it comes to their collection, One of the first pieces of art, whenever you come in and you turn immediately, I'm closing my eyes so that I can visualize where I'm going. You come in and you turn to your left, there is an artwork, and I'm going to forget the artist's name, which is just like, they're going to come and take my degrees and that's fine. But it's a deconstructed Kuji sweater. And Kuji sweaters are a thing that was like a huge like fashion mainstay in 90s hip hop and rap. Biggie Smalls wore Kuji sweaters. He rapped about them. It's an amazing thing to see. I got to watch some school-age children come in whose parents must have listened to this music, and they saw themselves reflected in that piece of artwork, which is great to have happen, but really important to have happen as one of the first pieces of artwork that they see. Because now their sort of frame of coming into the space that doesn't look like it's made for them, whose staff does not reflect them, one of the first messages that they see is, oh, I can see myself in this space. So how can I reimagine some of the other things that I see or that I'm going to come in contact with? So thinking about what you're presenting, what artwork you're presenting, and when and how you're presenting it can go a long way to sort of breaking down some of those sometimes perceived and sometimes real psychological barriers to different types of artwork. So in the interest of time, I'm going to hop back into the presentation. And address my allergies. Thank you, eyeballs. Okay. So the most important takeaway about organizational culture as you get in and you think about some of the stuff that we've talked about and some of the indicators is to think about what is set in stone. Most of us assume that most of what's happens in our organizations is set in stone, but thinking about what is just habit and what is right for change. So things that are actually set in stone are going to be things that keep you from getting sued, right? Things that help you to, do your everyday operations or make sure that you're eligible for funding from the different spaces where you seek funding. But other things might just be habit, and a lot of stuff might be right for change, and it's about actively assessing that. So there might be some change that occurs at the individual level as a result of this. And that could be hearts and minds, or it could just be behavioral shifts. That then impacts the way in which the organization runs. And then once organizations begin to have conversations with each other about the changes that you're making, which is why I love workshop spaces like this, where people get to have cross-organizational and cross-sectoral conversations, you can begin to impact the ecosystem in which you operate. So engagement, again, just reminding you that there are many different ways that socially acceptable ways of inequity can impact your everyday engagement with people. So something that might be seemingly as benign as correcting somebody's English might be something where you're actually like denigrating a different kind of dialect, which is another way to exert sort of power and authority over someone. So think about the many ways in which bias can show up. It can be something like we tend to think about the large overt things, the like, I didn't give that person a raise, or I didn't hire that person, or I purposefully said that you can't show a particular type of art. But the ways in which it actually tends to be more pernicious and pervasive are the smaller instances of presuming that somebody doesn't have classical training just because of the ways in which they identify, or presuming that somebody doesn't have the aptitude to engage with a particular type of art or a particular type of artwork just because of who they might be. So it's really important to begin to interrogate the larger things, but also the smaller everyday things, because that's what your employees, your volunteers, and your community members are exposed to on a regular basis. Yes, thinking about the ways in which it might show up on your website are really important, but thinking about the ways in which it shows up in an everyday conversation as somebody's passing your organization, or if somebody's sitting on your step and you didn't want them to be sitting on your step, what the implications of that might be in your everyday interactions. When you're looking at both the ways in which you operate and the ways in which you think about paying artists or paying or not paying interns, the ways in which you engage with volunteers, thinking about the ways in which you might be practicing bureaucratic violence or organizational violence. Those are really important as well. So does somebody need to jump through as many hoops that are set up? There was an instance where somebody had a medical issue and they were made to go and get multiple letters from a doctor and to have their supervisor sign off when it really wasn't that necessary. And so that's an instance where you could be inviting bias and inequity simply by a longstanding bureaucratic practice that hasn't been interrogated. So systemic racism is baked into the system. And systemic inequities are a part of the ways in which your organization operates that may be copy and pasted to other things. So in an effort to be efficient, often we will copy and paste like the ways in which you sign up for programming or the ways in which you buy tickets or the ways in which you communicate with certain members of staff. It's easy to replicate things because that's what you've done in the past. But if you haven't interrogated each of those practices, then you're baking inequities into a number of ways in which you operate throughout your organization. So it's important to think about how do we share information? How do we share opportunities? How do we think about the ways in which we're inviting people into our organization, both as sort of patrons and people that are going to pay us for the stuff that we do, and the services or offerings that we are giving for free? Do we have some, presumptions about the differences between those two types of individual? And if so, how do we get to the root of the issue, right? So we might get to somebody has to provide their income in order to get this service for free. That's a behavioral piece, like a bureaucratic piece. But what's the underlying assumption or presumption as to why you need to know somebody's income to offer a service for free? That's what you need to have a conversation or deeper conversations about, because you might be able to change that one piece of inequity that's a practice. So we're not going to require the income anymore. But if you haven't really interrogated the underlying assumption or the foundational premise as to why you required it in the first place, inequity will find a way, to quote Jeff Goldblum, inequity will find a way to just create another bureaucratic practice that meets the same organizational value. So I think it's really important to share some information across organizations. And the last bit of what we're going to talk about is a little brief, so we will still have a decent amount of time for our overarching conversations. I do see that I have a couple of comments that I'll address whenever we come back for the breakout sessions. But I do want everybody to have an opportunity to share out what it is that you're thinking about as far as tackling some of the embedded inequities in your organization as it relates to communicating with and engaging with individuals that your organization might be wanting to engage with but hasn't just yet. So you're going to have another 4 minutes. We will cut a little bit into Q&A, but not by much, I promise. So another 4 minutes. This time your moderator is going to be the person whose birthday is the closest to today. So Price is Right rules without going over, right? So nothing that's already happened, but the closest birthday to today moving forward. Okay. Okay, so who has some ways that they're thinking about starting this work or continuing this work at their organization? What were some of the things that were shared?
Well, we talked about issues like job descriptions that limit the applicants, focusing rather than on what degrees you have and how many years of experience, what's your interest in the job and what skills you're bringing. And then also for a lot of us, probably the process of identifying what are the areas where we actually have potential inequities that we should be working on, and then we can figure out what the solutions might be.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so figuring out where to get started is really important work that a lot of people skip right over on their way to jumping into solutions. And it's like, a solution to what? So yes, that is really important work. The reason why I find a lot of organizations want to skip over it is because it is the least sexy work, right? It's not cute. You can't really take a picture of it, right? Like, here's a picture of all the places that were inequitable that we need to address. Like, it doesn't really lend itself for the About Us page on your website, but it is definitely integral work. Kristen?
Hi. First, I want to thank you for having these breakout sessions. I really enjoy them. And then my group, we had some interesting conversations about, one was like a person does a lot of like classical work. And she even said like talking about a lot of old dead white guys plays and whatnot. And she was talking about how there's this great opportunity to like go in and re-examine those plays within her work, and how she's really excited to start doing that. And then a few other themes that we had was people kind of connecting and integrating with other groups too. So we have a person who works on historical stuff and trying to reach out to other historical societies. And another person is working with like women's vets and trying to make sure that you're doing that mindfully and making sure that you're taking advantage of all the resources that you have in your community so that it's done equitably.
I am a really big proponent of cohort learning, which is why I love like workshop settings like this, and getting a group, whether or not it's formal and it's funded by a particular organization, but getting a group of 4 or 5 organizations together, if they happen to coalesce around the same subject matter area, awesome. But if not, it's just easier to learn this stuff with someone else. So getting a cohort together of individuals who are interested in reading and questioning and having difficult conversations can be a really important way of making sure that you don't get social justice fatigue, or when you do get social justice fatigue, that there's somebody else to help like sort of lift you up and bolster you up while continuing to do your work. So there are a couple things that were from the chat that I wanted to mention. Guillermo noted about implicit bias and looking at some of the Harvard tools for assessing your implicit bias. Those are really great tools to get a baseline. You will be surprised by the results. And one of the reasons that I know this is because I've been involved with a lot of organizations who said, our board's not diverse and we need to diversify our board. I just want to caution you, the diversity does not mean equity. And here's why. The most surprising thing for a lot of people that take these implicit bias assessments is their internalized implicit biases. What I mean by that is lots of women find that they are biased against women in the workplace or in authority positions. That's internalized bias. There are a lot of people of color who have internalized a lot of the negative messaging and ways of being and having to navigate in a world that is not designed or to uplift them. And so they will find that they have a lot of, or a heavy amount, or more than they thought they would, implicit bias against other people of color. What that means in practice is that, say your board is completely male and you want to diversify by including more women, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that your organization is going to be more equitable from a gender equity perspective or gender identity perspective, because 1, you're still operating on a binary, and 2, you might just invite somebody that agrees with all of the the inequities that already exist, or isn't actively aware about how to dismantle them. So yes, take stock of where you are, take stock of the things in which the things that you have to work on. I know for me personally, I'm working on deep internalized capitalism and thinking about my self-worth when I'm napping, right? And when I'm not working, and when my body isn't producing something other than rest. So, there are many different ways to have to do some internal work as a result of these biases measures. Yes, so there was a note that others can help you catch your blind spots too. It's the same thing with peer review. Whenever you're writing something or you're working on a grant, like other people, you get into a sense of flow for yourself, right? Your brain can correct the ways in which you might be inequitable, or writing mistakes that you tend to make. Sometimes you need somebody else to catch them. Other things from the chat were discussing about opportunity hoarding. And the ways in which it can impact wanting to find free interns or not paying a not paying a living wage because of the ways in which, the nonprofit sort of scarcity structure exists and is championed. Many of our organizations, especially arts organizations, transition from starving artists to starving arts administrator. And so being mindful of how to dismantle that is also important. The other thing that came to me privately was a question about how do you know if your organization has achieved equity? Is the demographics of your organization match those of the community? So unfortunately, there is no grand like you have arrived at equity and you can turn off your GPS. There are indicators that your organization might be more equitable, and one of those markers would be, does the leadership within your organization and the staff of your organization match those that you serve? So that's definitely an indicator. I would say as far as achieving equity, you want to get to a space where your organization knows how to integrate and learn. So there are going to be missteps. You're going to say the wrong thing, or maybe miss an opportunity to dismantle inequities or be more equitable. A lot of people are looking at what happens next for your organization. And that's the really important part about like achieving equity or working towards equity. I have a few more things that I want to push through and then open it up for general comments and discussion. So one of the common missteps with engaging with community members is to invite them in simply to reinforce or reassert the fact that you presumably know more than they do about the subject matter area, and making it very clear that from a transactional perspective, you're only interested in them for the community aspect or the bodies or the butts and seats that they can bring to you. This might not be explicitly stated, but it might be implicit in the ways in which you set up the seating in the room for a community dialogue, right? If everybody that has power is at one side of the table and everybody that is from the community is at the far end of the table, that's an implicit message. If somebody starts to talk about the artistic things or the management side of things, and you talk over them to say, we're really only interested in the ways in which you can bring more community members or the community engagement aspect of this partnership, that's another way that messaging can occur. It can happen in some more subtle ways, but I've actually seen some of those examples. So I want to make sure that that's on everybody's radar. Intellectual laziness when it comes to thinking about the ways in which you can engage with community members is one of the easiest ways to undermine your equity efforts. What I mean by that is you need to understand, for the communities that you're trying to engage with, what's important to them and how your organization can tap into what's important to them. Go to a local school board meeting, go to a city council meeting, hear what the community leaders that are there show up and say, hear what the issues are that are on the table, and really get to understand your community outside of your particular artistic practice or what your organization does, because you might have creative solutions or art-based solutions, or at least ways of seeing their concerns reflected in the community. Give credit where credit is due. So if you're engaged in a collaboration with community partners and they come to you with an idea, it's really important that you not sort of appropriate or take over their idea, because that is another manifestation of white supremacy culture. And so that would just be another reinforcement, even if you think you're doing good work and working towards equity, that you have signaled to the community that you're not really there yet. So it's really important to be mindful and to demonstrate gratitude when people are engaging with you. Don't pick the same partner over and over and over again. So you found one organization that maybe has a person of color or a non-binary individual at the helm, and you are really excited about partnering with them, and you think it opens up your worldview and your organization's ways that they can engage with other communities, and then you stop there. And that's the only person that identifies in a different way that you engage with. So you need to diversify your diversity, if you will. And by that, I mean, don't think just about organizations that are directly or tangentially related to the work that you do. There is some great and really fruitful work that comes out of partnerships with organizations that serve different facets of the populations that you're interested in engaging with. So it's about being very creative with the solutions that you're coming up with and with the programming that you're coming up with. Again, tapping into what's important to various members of your community is a great way to figure out and identify some of the places where this could occur. You also want to track what it is that you're doing. So establish some evaluation parameters. Do you want to make sure that the ways in which you go about creating and maintaining a partnership are more equitable? If so, how would you count that? Like what things would you count to identify whether or not you're moving towards that goal? And sometimes there are positive impacts and negative impacts, and that's okay. You're learning. You just want to not be recreating the same harm over and over again. So time to do that stuff is now. I'm going to go ahead and stop the share and we can jump into more question and discussion.
Great. Thank you, Brea. So as she said, we are going to move into our Q&A part of the presentation for the next 15 minutes. So if you're able to stay on and would like to ask any questions, feel free to place them in the chat, or you can use the raise your hand feature and you can be called on to unmute and ask your question. And as everyone's kind of thinking, we did have a question that was submitted that I'll go ahead and read and we can start with, if that sounds good with you, Brea. So the question was, we have been having discussions internally regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion. On a few occasions, we found that life experience differences between whites and people of color can dredge up pain and anger or create unintended friction. Sometimes that friction gets pretty heated. We're all going into this with the attitude that we want our membership to better reflect the diversity of the community and that we want everyone to feel welcome and have equitable representation in the art that we present. We think that the organization and our community will be better for it. But in these conversations, we sometimes find ourselves stumbling over baggage that comes with having very different life experiences. Individuals sometimes offend others with or are offended by comments that are not intended to be hurtful, but reflect the differences in life experiences of people of color and white individuals. What are some good ways to frame the discussion to prevent this type of conflict or address it when it happens?
So, and we'll delve a little bit deeper into some of the solutions to that question or address that question in the next session as well. But for this session, I would say that you're probably, if you are having these conversations in a real and meaningful way, you're not going to be able to avoid those instances. You might get lucky and you might just not have one of those instances in a conversation. But by and large, addressing some of the longstanding ways in which an organization has not been inclusive of everybody is going to dredge up some of the history. Like longstanding implies that there is historical context. And I think a lot of organizations unintentionally draw a line in the sand from when they decided that they were going to do this work and say that like history starts today. But that's not necessarily the case for everybody that's been in and around or involved with the organization. And so the ways to address that is to set up some parameters at the onset of the conversation about how long we will engage in those aspects of the conversation, right? So you don't want the conversation to be completely derailed by bringing up past information or past practices or past harm. However, you do need to hear and understand what that past harm is so that you do not repeat it in just a different form or in a shinier and newer way. Those conversations are going to be difficult. They are not always going to feel good. But I like to remind people that your behavior can either be a sticker or a tattoo. So if somebody's telling you that you've created harm in the past, you can decide whether or not that is permanent behavior that you are going to keep and maintain, or if even though the sticker's been on for a little bit and it hurts a little bit to take it off, if you are going to actively reflect on what's being shared and change the practice or behavior. It's also jarring to hear about the lived experiences of others, especially if you've been operating from a place of privilege. I always encourage people at the onset to remind everybody in the room, if you think it's difficult to hear about it, imagine what it is like living it and try to be mindful of how you act and react in the moment. So there's a difference between having emotions or being, we're human beings and we act and react to things with our emotions. I'm not saying that everybody in the room needs to be devoid of them, but there's a difference between having an emotion and being emotional and taking up all the air in the room with your response to somebody else's lived experience. And I ask people to be mindful about that.
Great, thank you. I'm looking through the chat. I'm not seeing any other questions so far. No other raised hands. So if that's the case, we can go ahead and start wrapping up. And as we are wrapping up, I would like if everyone could type in one word describing the session in the chat. I'm going to open this up. Okay.
And I'll also call out the citation or the source that Kristen put into the chat about the weaponization of tears.
Thank you. So these are some of our upcoming workshops. All of the sessions are from 12 to 1:30. Again, with those last about 30 minutes being reserved for discussion. Brea will be returning for our next workshop, and then the speaker for our June workshop will be announced soon. We would also like to remind you that the FY22 Operating Support Grant application closes April 14th, and the application to use the Capital One Hall for Season 2 closes May 1. And in case you haven't been following the daily poetry readings for Poetry Month, please check out our website or social media channels. I'm also at the end going to be including a link to an evaluation in the chat and also in a follow-up email with everyone. And I hope that you'll take a few minutes to complete it. I want to give a big thank you to Brea. We really appreciate your time and for helping to speak on this workshop today. And I'd also like to acknowledge two of our advisory group members who joined us for our workshop today, Edgar and Yati. We really appreciate your being here. And I would also like to thank our sponsors, the Arts Forward Fund, National Endowment for the Arts, Reston Community Center, and Virginia Commission for the Arts. So I'm going to stop sharing this. I'll go ahead and put in a link to the evaluation. Okay, lots of thank yous. thorough and well
Yeah.
organized.
Thank you everyone for your time and attention today. I'm going to put my email address in the chat if you have any additional questions or stuff and things.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. Have a great day.